As Pastor Laura mentioned last week, we are in the middle of what are called the Bread of Life Sundays. 5 weeks where the reading focuses on the 6th chapter of the Gospel of John. 5 weeks where you scratch your heads and whisper to yourselves, did Pastor Sam forget to update the bulletin because it says the exact same thing that it did last week? The first sermon that I ever preached at my internship congregation was for one of these Bread of Life weeks, and I talked about how my mom, who's also a pastor, would purposefully schedule vacation time during this string of Sundays. Now, I'm not saying that Alyssa and I planned our wedding, or that my friends Barney and Kim planned their wedding around the church's lectionary, but it sure was a happy coincidence. I will say, though, that if there had to be one food item that we focused on for this many weeks in a row, I'm glad it's bread, because I love bread. Regardless of what Jesus said in the 4th chapter of Matthew about how one does not live by bread alone, my family is pretty certain that both my dad and I would be just fine. For him, it's rye bread. In my extended family, Santa rarely wanted milk and cookies, but a sandwich on some good rye bread, now that is another story. For me, though, it's always been sourdough. My go-to order at Giants games growing up was the clam chowder in a sourdough bread bowl, a fact that my Midwest relatives have always had a hard time accepting. And I've actually been on quite the hunt for the best sourdough down here in San Diego, and thanks to Alyssa, have found it at a place called Conpane down in Liberty Station. Let me know if you need the address. On our way back from the trip that we just took to Northern California after the wedding, Alyssa and I stopped in my hometown of Half Moon Bay. And there were 2 things that I insisted on us getting: a burrito from Tres Amigos and sourdough from Moonside Bakery. And side note, I think that the burrito of life could have been a great alternative metaphor. But sadly, I don't think that Jesus ever got to experience the joy that is a burrito during his time here on earth, which truly is a tragedy. But anyway, the sourdough from Moonside is my absolute favorite. And so I did what any rational person would do. I bought 4 loaves of it. Now, before you judge me too much, one of the loaves was for my parents, but I'll admit that we, and by we I mean I, ate almost an entire loaf before we even got to them. So the other 2 are safely packaged away in the freezer, and I am doing my best to ration them. So suffice it to say, I'm a big fan of bread, which makes these 5 Bread of Life Sundays more palatable. But before we get to Jesus, I want to start with the reading from Exodus. This reading comes right after Moses has dramatically and heroically led the enslaved people of Israel through the Red Sea and delivered them safely out of the clutches of Pharaoh and his armies, a scene that was masterfully recreated in this year's Vacation Bible School videos. And when I say right after, I mean that literally just happened. And here they are already starting to complain. The whole of the Exodus journey actually is filled with some pretty entertaining stories, or entertaining for us at least. I'm sure that for Moses, the incessant whining and belly aching would have been insufferable. It's the ancient equivalent of, "Are we there yet? Are we there yet? Are we there yet?" And one of my favorite lines, similar to the one we heard today, comes from the book of Numbers, where the Israelites say, quite dramatically, "Why have you brought us up out of Egypt to die in the wilderness? For there is no food and no water, and we detest this miserable food." Now, okay, either there's nothing to eat or the food is terrible, but they can't both be true statements. But as funny as all of this is, it also highlights one of the key purposes of the biblical narrative. Now, the Bible is a very complicated book, and the stories that are included were written for many different intended purposes. Some are meant to provide teaching, to share wisdom and guidance. Others chronicle the lives of heroes of the faith, so that we might seek to emulate them. And others still hold up a mirror to humanity. They expose our true way of being in the world, ways that are, not always the most flattering. I think that part of why I am so drawn to the humor of these stories is that I'm a little afraid to face the truth in them, the truth that I actually relate to the Israelites quite a bit. Because intertwined with their complaints and ridiculous comments is a pining, nostalgia for the things that once were. And I am quite the nostalgic person, sometimes a little too nostalgic. I mentioned how Alyssa and I visited Half Moon Bay the other week, but that wasn't her first time that she had been. No, that happened last summer when I subjected her to the ultimate walk down memory lane. I took her by my old house. We walked down Main Street, and I told her stories of late night shenanigans that I can't repeat here. I showed her the McDonald's drive-thru that our marching band would go through in formation during band camp. I even took her up to the high school and told her all about my different teachers and classes, and she was so patient and kind through it all, but did seize an opportunity when I got lost trying to figure out which locker had been mine to gently suggest that maybe we could move on and continue with our plan for the day. I will admit, that was a day when my nostalgia got a little out of hand. In general, I like to think that my recollecting of stories is a way of connecting that which mattered greatly to me in the past with that which matters greatly to me in the present, and sometimes that is the case. That's the pure side of nostalgia, the good side of it, but there is a less pure, a less healthy side of it as well that we see in the actions of the Israelites out in the wilderness. When faced with the discomfort and uncertainty of the present, they immediately retreat to the comfort and sureness of the past. The rose-colored glasses come out, and suddenly life in Egypt wasn't all that bad. I mean, there was the whole slavery thing and all the forced labor, but at least they had those shacks. And they had all the flesh pots, which, unlike the more modern definition, were essentially stew pots of meat. And let us not forget how they ate their fill of bread. They become nostalgic for a time in their lives when they were miserable, a time that they couldn't wait to escape from. Isn't it amazing and a little bit scary that given the right circumstances, we as humans can romanticize some truly terrible parts of our lives? Now, yes, there is something to be said for new experiences providing perspective, reevaluating things based on new information, but that's not what's happening here. What's happening here is an unhealthy and maladaptive retreat from the discomforts of the known to the comfort of the known, regardless of its quality. Better the devil you know than the one you don't. I recently read an article that was reflecting on the phenomenon of people rewatching TV shows that they had already seen. In the era of Netflix and Hulu, it's never been easier to return to shows from our past that we loved and watch them again. But the article pointed out that it's not simply a case of going back and watching once and then moving on to something new. Instead, people are choosing to watch these shows again and again and again. And the article postulated that part of the reason for this was that the comfort of knowing what was going to happen was so wonderful. In a world where we face unprecedented levels of anxiety and uncertainty, the ability to predict and anticipate something, even if it's just an old TV show, can be incredibly comforting. In the midst of all the stress of life, it's a known commodity that can be trusted and counted on. And while I'm sure that there are plenty of other reasons and factors that go into it, that theory sure made a lot of sense to me. I think it's interesting that this story from Exodus should come up now, because I've been seeing a lot of comparisons being made between the Israelites' wilderness journey and the journey that we are all on through the wilderness of COVID. Now, I don't think that a direct one-to-one comparison is appropriate, but I do think that some interesting parallels can be drawn. Just as we thought that the promised land was in sight, this Delta variant seems to have turned our course back out into the desert. And over the past 17 months, there has been a great deal of pining for the flesh pots and bountiful bread baskets of 2019. But as we traveled further into the wilderness, a few brave voices began to question whether or not we should be hoping for a pure return to normal once all this is done. A return to a time when the phrase essential workers was all but unknown, and our admiration and appreciation of them was in no way newsworthy. A time when our schedules were packed to the gills, when we celebrated exhaustion and working through illness. A time when many were blissfully unaware of the impact and pervasiveness of systemic racism in our society. And slowly but surely, the phrase, when we go back to normal, let's not go back to normal, began to circulate in our news feeds and our everyday conversations. Author and poet Sonia Renee Taylor put it this way: "We will not go back to normal. Normal never was. Our pre-corona existence was not normal, other than we normalized greed, inequity, exhaustion, depletion, extraction, disconnection, confusion, rage, hoarding, hate, and lack. We should not long to return, my friends. We are being given the opportunity to stitch a new garment, one that fits all of humanity and nature." It's in our nature as humans to be drawn to the comfort of that which we already know, that which has already happened. We like the hardships of the past because we already know the outcome. We already know that we've made it through all right, but that orientation towards the past is not how God would have us live. For we have a God who is always pulling us into the future, a God who is always leading us into bright new tomorrows, tomorrows that no doubt hold their fair share of turmoil and strife, but we are not expected to blindly walk into that unknown tomorrow by ourselves. No, we are given the promise of sustenance and guidance. We are given the promise of manna that will nourish and sustain us through our present moment as tangible sign of God's love and commitment to us. The interesting thing about manna was that it only lasted for one day. Those who tried to collect and hoard it found it rancid the following morning, which is a beautiful message about daily returning to God with hope and faith and trust that we will be seen through yet another day. But God also knows that we can be an anxious and nervous people, which is why Jesus was sent into the world. Sent into this world to be bread as we have never before known. Sent into this world so that we might have life and have it abundantly. And notice the tense structure of what Jesus says. Whoever comes to me will never be hungry, and whoever believes in me will never be thirsty. It is a promise that is embedded in tomorrow, a promise that draws us into the new life that God intended for us. Now, I know that not everybody struggles with nostalgia to the degree that I do. And I know that people have many different coping mechanisms to deal with the anxiety and the fear that are caused by the unknown. And heck, there's probably a few of you who don't even feel anxiety or fear about the unknown or the future. And if that's the case, I hope that you've been able to successfully zone out and make productive use of this sermon time. And please share your secrets with the rest of us. But just in case you ever do happen to feel that way, I hope you remember the promises that we talked about today. I hope you remember the sureness and steadfast nature of God. The point of recollection is not to go into the past and get stuck there or to desperately try and go back. Rather, it is so that we might recall all of the ways that God has been faithful and upheld the promise of accompaniment and care. To take solace in that and let it instill in us the courage to walk boldly into that unknown tomorrow. I cannot guarantee that the promised land lies just around the corner, but I know with all my heart that God will be with us on every step that we take. Amen.